Human wildlife. Oh, that's a reminder. The meeting is being recorded and the recording will be available later on. So we are the Human Wildlife Interactions Working Group of the Conservation Translocation Specialist Group. And we have been together since 2018. The group is formed by people who work with conservation translocations and practitioners, researchers, and students. We use the group as a way of exchanging information and getting to know other people and getting to discuss problems and solutions. So this is one of these events. The focus of our event today is looking at conservation inclusivity in conservation translocation practice. And we have two talks. The first one today, Tuesday the 10th, will be led by Sean Waters. And the next one will be next Tuesday at the same time. And that one will be led by another colleague, by Monica Engel. And today's talk will start in a moment. And I would like to invite you to also join us next Tuesday. Both events will be recorded and the recordings will be available. I will also share with you information about our group, our publications. We have published guidelines to facilitate human-wildlife interactions in conservation translocations in 2022. We're working on a guidelines companion to the conservation translocations guidelines of IUCN, which were published in 2013. We are working on human dimensions guidelines companion for that, hopefully to be published next year. But we have a ResearchGate site and a website and a Facebook presence, and you are all invited to take part, okay? So you may have seen our invitation for both talks. The general theme, again, is inclusivity in conservation translocation practice. It's a wide theme. It touches into the historical past of conservation translocations and on present need to be working with communities, some traditional, some indigenous communities, in a way that doesn't impose an external view. So these are all very tricky questions. I'm going to, I hope everyone is here. I hope you enjoy, and we'll stay to the end. We have an hour and a half of session today. We might not use that much, but we might as well do it. Sean will introduce her case study from her own practice. And after her presentation, we'll open to everyone for a discussion. And the discussion, we welcome people contributing from their own practice or their own research. And this is what this is for, okay? This is basically a discussion forum for exchange, yeah, and building a community of practice. So I'm going to invite Sean to share her screen, introduce herself, and then start her talk. Thank you. Please feel free to add any comments or to write questions at the end or unmute yourself to ask questions at the end. And I'll use the comment box to share our links with you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Adriana. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about my own particular experiences of looking at conservation practice through a different lens. Why is that on? Can you see that stupid thing on there? I can't get it off. Bugger.
Sean, I'm just going to remind you to introduce yourself first, yeah?
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll do that. Hang on, I'm getting in a tizzy. Okay, here we are. Okay, yeah, I'm going to talk about my experiences with conservation translocations in just a second, Adriana. But for now, I'm a member of the Barbary Macaque Awareness and Conservation team working in Morocco. I'm also the vice chair of the Primate Specialist Group section on human-primate interactions. And I do various other things, including working with Adriana's group. Okay, so conservation is fundamentally about human behavior, as we all know, and to address conservation needs, which are many and complex, it's crucial to engage with people who are also many and complex. I think understanding the historical and socio-cultural context of the area in which you're going to work or have been working or will be working is extremely important. And I think it enables us to better position ourselves politically and socially within the communities in which we are working. Nobody, nobody is an island. I think that's something, it's more common now to, talk about the historical and sociocultural context, but still I think there are many gaps in our understanding of what that actually means. I think, though, if you reflect on what you find out about both those contexts, it can facilitate the development of effective conservation initiatives, and these will be more likely to have the support and involvement of the local people. So I'm going to talk about my positionality, my journey through this metamorphosis, if you like, from very much looking at things through a Western scientific lens to looking at things in a very different way. And this is what I learned. So this is my experience. And first of all, what am I doing? First of all, I worked in Canada with the Cochrane Ecological Institute, and they are experts in the captive breeding of swift fox for reintroduction. And I was lucky enough to be able to work with that swift reintroduction program on the Blackfeet Tribal Lands in Montana in USA. And this is what you can see here. This is the sort of stuff that, we are releasing the foxes there. And then I also did some rehab and release of black bears also with Cochrane Ecological Institute. And then I moved on to begin my own conservation project with my Moroccan colleagues to work with Barbary macaques. And we do some translocation work here with confiscated infant Barbary macaques, because the Barbary macaque males will adopt infants if they're and then they will kind of, if they're past weaning age, they have a good chance of survival. So we tend to try and put them back into the wild just to stop them having to go into rescue centres and stuff. And I think it's one of the few primates you can probably do that with. Oh, why isn't that working? There we are. Okay, so this is I'm going to talk first about the swift fox and the Blackfeet tribe in Montana. And the swift fox, as you saw in the picture, is a very small fox, native to the prairies, and it was extirpated in Montana by the 1950s. And that was for fur trade and all sorts of different things. However, the species, like many other wildlife species, plays an important cultural role in the Northern Plains tribes. It was very important to the Blackfeet. It was perceived to play an integral part of the regeneration of their culture post-colonialist, and it also returned biodiversity, of course. So they're trying to return their lands to as close as possible to how it was pre-colonization, and they've introduced lots of other species as well, including bison. So this reintroduction took place between 1997 and 2001 on the Blackfeet Tribal Lands with the captive bred foxes, and I worked on it for the last few years. Now, most of the time, I was following the foxes, looking to see how they were doing, but I did obviously work quite closely with the Blackfeet, and these were the kind of intercultural obstacles, if you like, which that's what they seemed to me at the time. But actually, they were, the difference of two cultures coming together. So you find sometimes with Native American people, they don't like any kind of fiddling with the animals. They don't like to radio collaring sometimes, although the Blackfeet were very tolerant of us radio collaring some animals. The annual releases had to take place at the same site because it was sacred to the Blackfeet, and it was the confluence of two rivers on the Blackfeet lands. And obviously this meant that we were releasing animals every year for 5 years, and they were all being released into the same place. And so the first few years, the animals were able to find ranges like not too far away from the release site. But obviously, as the years went on, these areas became quite full, and so the foxes had to travel further. And obviously, this put them at a disadvantage from predators and other, cars and other things. So that was what you could call an obstacle. And the other thing was the Blackfeet weren't really bothered if we published papers or, presented on this stuff or anything like that. It was, the recognition by Western science of what they were doing was immaterial to them and to the project's success. And this is summed up very, very well by Ira Newbreast, who was then the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service on the Blackfeet Tribal Lands. And he says the project worked because matters of the heart and spirit must guide the way. It was simply the right thing to do. And in fact, the swift fox did very well and are still doing very well, and are spread outside the reserve now, reservation now. So then we move to something completely different, really. I mean, the swift fox was a very small fox, about the size of a cat. And when I was working on the reservation and around the reservation, ranchers both on the reservation and outside the reservation were quite happy to see it because it killed gophers as far as they were concerned, and they disliked gophers much more than they disliked the swift fox. But here we have, a very different matter where you've got macaque, albeit an African macaque, the only one outside Asia that occurs naturally. Found in North Africa, only in Morocco and Algeria now. And yes, it's the one that's on Gibraltar, but the ones in the wild ones are a lot nicer than the ones on Gibraltar. Threatened by the usual suspects of habitat destruction and degradation. And some populations are seriously threatened by captures of pet trade. That's our website there. So I think when you look, this is where you find Barbary macaques now all along the North African, Algeria, Morocco, and they used to occur obviously in Tunisia, Libya, and all those places, but they're extinct there now. And if you look at this map, this is where Barbary macaque ape remains have been found from Iron Age, Roman, and medieval Europe. So they've had an extremely long relationship with people because of their position on the Mediterranean. They are, obviously prime candidates for capture, to sell as pets or curiosities or whatever people wanted them for. The oldest known finding is from Northern Ireland, and that was from the Iron Age. So, I mean, obviously we don't know exactly how these people related to these monkeys and what they used them for, but the fact that they are so widely dispersed in the Mediterranean, in human settlements, as remains in human settlements, is obviously an indicator of how important they were. As well, they are persecuted by people in some areas of the distribution for crop foraging. And the macaques are viewed as a revenue generator for tourism in many cities of Morocco, particularly Marrakesh, and are obviously portrayed as such by the media. Every time there's an article about tourism in Morocco, there's usually a picture of some idiot with a macaque on his head. So where did I decide to start working? Well, our site, our main area of work is Bourchian Forest. So this is Spain, and this is kind of where we are in relation to Europe, so very, very close to Europe. It's mixed oak forest, and that's used by people from surrounding villages who are agropastoralists. They grow food crops, and they also herd their goats into the forest for grazing. And they use the forest for other products as well. So how did I find out how people related to and behaved towards and thought about the Barbary macaque? Well, I used a lot of qualitative data. I relied on qualitative data. So I used an ethnographic method where I used various methods to collect data. I didn't have an hypothesis to prove or disprove, so that's very different from quantitative science. use participant observation. So I watched what people did, because people don't always do what they say they do. In-depth interviews with certain individuals, and then informal interviews, focus groups, chats with other community members. Basically, it's called deep hanging out by anthropologists. And the analysis is subjective, and theory emerges from the data, and this is often referred to as anecdotal data, although I think that's a bit that doesn't really sum up the amount of really rich and interesting information you can find out from qualitative data. So by its very nature, it's reflexive, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. It's complex, it's difficult, and it's very nuanced, which is exactly what I wanted. So the political and socio-cultural context that I was talking about earlier, politically, we have to remember that colonialism was a thing and is still a thing. It hasn't gone away. It affected people and still affects people who were colonized. The Rif was actually colonized by the Spanish and not French between 27 and 1956. They exploited forests for timber and did not invest in infrastructure, because Spain at that time wasn't in a great place itself. So at that time, Buashim is very marginalized. It was very marginalized. It's very remote. It was less remote probably when the Spanish were in control, because they were exploiting the whole area for timber. But the villagers were basically treated like, nobody special, nobody important, no power, no nothing. Their thoughts and their opinions weren't sought by the occupying power. And unfortunately, since then, the state and urban society has also tended to exclude these people from their, decisions about resource and conservation management. So it's all planned by outside agencies. In addition, the forestry department relied on a sort of spy system. And so that is always a recipe for disaster and basic corruption. Also, villages tend to be scapegoated by forestry guards. So we've sometimes seen crews of people with tractors and chainsaws doing illegal logging in the forest. And the forestry guards are either cognizant of this or they're ignorant of it, and they always blame the shepherds. I don't know where they think the shepherds have got a chainsaw and a lorry, but there you go. They were also belittled by the urban middle class, and a lot of the development NGOs that were there at the time, they just believed that they didn't understand development or conservation, and they needed all this assistance. And the villagers were actually very conscious of this discrimination, and they would demonstrate their resistance, both covertly by ignoring initiatives that were put in place for them by these development NGOs, and sometimes overtly when things were just gone, that they just thought some stuff was just too unjust, because some families were benefiting far more than others. So that would end in direct confrontation, which is really not very good for village cohesion, when these villages are quite small, but they're very close knit, and they all depend on one another when things go horribly wrong, which they often do in mountainous areas, as we know. So understanding how and why local people resisted these initiatives, that sort of encouraged us to include them in our conservation research and activities. And obviously, at the time, we couldn't include everyone. So the people who we saw most often in the mountains when we were monitoring and trying to find Barbary macaques, to try and count them and understand their distribution and understand how many there were, we kind of recruited shepherds and co-produced knowledge on the distribution of Barbary macaque groups with them. And that worked extremely well. And we also got to know some of those men very well, and still know them. So in the course of our research, we discovered, unfortunately, that young shepherds would actively harass and kill macaques for sport. At the time, obviously, we were quite upset by this. And we understood that, shepherding is a boring, low-status job. Many of these young men and boys have told us they didn't want to do this job. But when they're in the forest, they're free of the social restrictions, you know, that inhibit their lives in the village. These villages are very traditional, very conservative. It's very difficult for young men and boys to kind of express themselves, if you like. And unfortunately, you know, when they were free and out in the mountains, this is how they did it. However, we discovered that when they married and became, you know, really their status improved in their village, in the village, they stopped doing this behavior. They didn't like doing it anymore. They just stopped. So I didn't, this macaque killing behavior, this is highlights my own cultural bias, you know, my ethnocentric repugnance to this practice. But my dilemma was, how could I or should I accelerate the change in behavior that obviously occurs as young men, as young boys become young men and secure their place in village society? And basically, you know, we just didn't do anything because I didn't think it was my place to wag my finger at those young men. You know, I have no idea how their lives are really and how their childhoods have been or anything like that. And basically, we decided that we would just carry on engaging with them, sitting and eating with them, talking to them, you know, listening to their stories about their lives and what's happening in their villages. The only thing we changed was we broadened the kind of information. They shared their information with us, and they had very good information about where the macaques were and where, you know, the different groups where they kind of moved around and stuff like that. But they had no information about Barbary macaques in general. So, for instance, they would say to me, "Why on earth have you come here? Why can't you watch these monkeys at home?" And I would say to them, well, they only occur in Morocco and Algeria, and Bourshim is one of the places, etc., etc. So I would we would share this sort of information, and this started in as well to change people's perceptions, because they realized that the macaque wasn't just everywhere. And why should they, you know all this general information about the bar macaques? It's not taught. Well, it wasn't taught to them. Obviously, we teach a bit about the bar macaque now in schools. But there was no reason why they should know about it. And, you know, in general, the macaques were held in very low esteem and were subjects of great amusement at the beginning of when we started to work there. So you couldn't talk about the macaques in groups of young men, because it would just end in laughter and you know, joking about, you know, your brother looks like a macaque, etc., etc. And 6 months in, that actually, we could actually talk about macaques and talk about, you know, where they'd seen them, what they were doing, what they were eating. And that showed that, you know, they were kind of coming around to the idea that maybe they were more important, and obviously some of them were keener on them than others. But this is how it worked with us. You know, it was obviously the right kind of approach, because Abdul Hafid, and this is the thing with qualitative data, we don't use numbers, we actually use quotes from people who we've spoken to, and he says, after always talking about macaques and telling you what we know, we started to believe it was wrong to kill them, and now we don't kill any, we leave them in peace. And some of them would also say, you know, we felt really guilty. We'd been killing macaques, and then we'd meet you in the forest and you'd talk to us and be so polite and treat us so well. And then we started to feel guilty about killing them, so we stopped. So either way, you know, we got the result that we were hoping for. So I think that's a good example of how, you know, my positionality or my background and everything else about me could have really made a mess of that. You know, if I'm telling them to stop it, it could have the opposite effect, where people could think, well, who is she to tell us what to do? We'll go and kill more macaques, for example. But I don't think it would have stopped anybody. Now, our positionality is you hear a lot about that, you know, these days in this talk about decolonising conservation stuff. It's basically who we are, influences and alters the data we collect. I think we need, and I needed to identify, for example, like I was trying to do, to try and understand the shepherds and why they were doing what they were doing. You know, I have been very privileged to have the opportunity of a good education. And I've had the opportunities to do lots of different things, whereas, you know, other people don't necessarily have those opportunities and not that lucky. So there's all the things about the personal aspects of our education, our background, our identity. These all impact on our research. They kind of influence what we study and how we study it. And also, obviously, the interpretation of the resulting data. And that's the same for quantitative and qualitative data, I have to say. I think it is. Particularly on the subjects you decide to investigate. So attending to our own position, I think in any case, it helps us to avoid underestimating and alienating people who will view conservation actions through a very different but equally valid lens. Not everyone thinks conservation is a great thing. And people will have very different ideas about how conservation needs to be done. I mean, we see that in the field, our own field. Now, reflexivity. I mentioned reflexivity in one of my earlier slides. What is that? Well, it's basically understanding and managing our influence on the research process. And this needs to be integral to conservation action planning, in my opinion. The use of ethnographic data, the collection and analysis, I found it encouraged me to foster my self-reflection about my role as a conservationist and as a social actor. Because like it or not, we're not invisible when we go into these communities. We are perceived as actors within the community, for good or ill. And some people will welcome us and some people will not. The history of an area is really important, and the effects of past colonialism are still being felt by many. I think if we listen to communities and we already understand, the historical, political, cultural context, then we're more likely to understand how our presence and activities may be understood. It's all very well trying to understand, how these people are reacting to the conservation activities, but how are they also reacting to us? So we need to be aware of ourselves as social actors, and so we definitely need to evaluate our own actions, values, and preferences, and perhaps revise them, because I've had to do that, and I still need to do it. If you're interested in following any of this stuff up, then we've got a lot of resources about ethnography, basically about primates, and also inclusivity and ethics, which is general, not just about primates, and how these can be included into conservation. They can be found on the website for the section on human-primate interactions. So let's sum up some of what I've learned. Like I say, expressing my ethnocentric repugnance for the torture and killing of macaques would probably have alienated the shepherds. So employing a non-confrontational approach, and which basically meant positively engaging, but with increased knowledge sharing, seemed to, persuade many of them that this wasn't a great thing to be doing. I found, and I still find, that understanding the history, context, and people is crucial to conservation practice. And I think the experience of two very different projects, because these cultures, belief systems, everything about the Blackfeet tribe and obviously the villages, the Morocco villages, are very, very different. But they encouraged me to examine my own biases, and I think they, working with very different cultures and projects, better equipped me to design culturally and socially appropriate conservation strategies. And the insight and commitment of the many years that I've worked with them, that's been provided by my Moroccan colleagues, has greatly contributed to the project success, as well as my own development and project success in recruiting villagers to conservation activities, which is another important thing that we've managed to do. Decolonizing your own practice, trying to be more inclusive, trying to be more ethical, trying to look at things through another lens. It's uncomfortable and it's challenging. But with, as far as I am concerned, it was accompanied with a fundamental shift in how I view conservation practice in general. I've not finished changing those views. I think there's still a long way that I have to go. But it's always a work in progress. This is from a paper from 2022, Decolonizing Primate Conservation Practice, case study from North Morocco. These are the things that, we thought were important for conservationists. Be humble, be aware, be perceptive, be informed, be influential, be realistic. And that's available at the paper. I won't read it all out here because I'm sure we're running out of time or whatever. Okay, so being concerned about people, particularly in conservation translocations, I think, is particularly in areas, because there's very few areas now that are devoid of people. And I think we need to understand how we in our organization's intentions and actions are viewed, because that will enable us to behave with increased sensitivity. I certainly see in some projects, particularly some primate rehabilitation and release projects, where communities' perceptions are just not, they're just assumed to be positive, and they're not necessarily. As I say, the people living in the release area may well not view the return or the release of wildlife as positive, and they may retaliate negatively towards the animals. If you don't do your prior planning and research and engagement, then some of those things are and have are likely to happen and have happened in the past. As I've said, we are seen as social actors, whether we see ourselves as social actors or not. We see ourselves as some kind of thing hovering over the surface of a community. And also, don't underestimate communities. Communities are not homogenous. Their communities are the same as any other small community, communities we all live in. Some people are nasty, some people are nice. People get on, people don't get on. There's a hierarchy. There's lots of different groups within a community. Like the shepherds were a kind of group, young men and boys were a group, women were a group, and there's different groups within those groups. So, don't make the mistake of thinking it's just one homogenous mass. It certainly isn't. So you will be seen as a social actor, and you will also be seen, if you're in charge, as the person responsible for the translocation. And that means that people will come to you and they will expect solutions if the released animals that have caused problems. Okay, those are my acknowledgements, and I'm ready for comments, so I will stop screen sharing.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Siân. Thank you very much. I personally really enjoyed it. Your presentation is something that we need to discuss a lot. So we are open now for questions and discussion. And so people, you might want to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or if you want to make a comment or talk about your own experience. And before you do, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Okay, so the floor is open. And I've got one question to kick off. Siân, I was thinking about when you look back at the Swift Fox and your work with Blackfeet, was there a light bulb moment? And tell us about it. What was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was there were a couple of things that kind of coalesced, and I'm very slow on the uptake, as you know, and they finally went ping. And I think one of those was the fact that the Blackfeet didn't really care at all if we published the paper on this thing. They really didn't care. So they didn't care. They knew it was going to be successful. And they wanted those foxes back. There was no persecution. There was nothing like that. And they were all really supportive. And there'd been a lot of engagement and kind of news on the reservation, beforehand, before the reintroduction took place. I think the fact that they weren't, I couldn't work out why they didn't want us to radio collar the foxes. And so in the first year, the radio collars were actually tracked rather than radio collared. But that was, I found out much later on, actually, that it was kind of a Native American thing where, sometimes Inuit don't like caribou radio collared. In the past, that's been, I don't know if that's the case now, but Monica will know, all about that. But yeah, I mean, there were all those things. And the fact, you would walk around the reservation and the tribal lands with them, and their belief system is so very different. And you kind of think about it in a very kind of, oh yes, that's very, it sounds awful, but you kind of think that's a very quaint way of looking at things. But then you meet these people and do actually believe it. And so you think, okay, who's to say they're wrong? There's no right or wrong way to think about, the universe or the planet or whatever. And And I think, that makes me sound really awful and really kind of patronizing, but I think it probably was at that time, really. I just came in with this, I'm the scientist, I know better than everybody. And obviously, I feel embarrassed about it now. But yeah, I mean, that's what I mean about it, things being uncomfortable, that you'd like to go back and be different. I think they were very, very gracious, to me, and very tolerant, much more tolerant than I deserved. But their approach did the trick, and they did knock into my thick skull that, yeah, goodness, not everyone views the world the way I do, or the way we do in the West. So yeah, that was, and I suppose that that prepared me then for the work in Morocco, I think. Much better, because obviously that's another hugely different culture for me. Very different way of looking at things. Not a very different way of looking at the primates. I just went in there thinking they'd all think they were lovely, but they didn't. They thought they were figures of fun and something to be exploited. Fair enough.
Well,
so
but
we
then
worked around that.
You got to it with already awareness that you needed to listen to how they see the macaques and
yeah, and I think it's the really active listening that is the best thing any conservationist can do, really.
Active listening. Actually, before I ask my next question, would anyone like to? I will just suggest, if you want to ask the question in Portuguese, I'm very happy to translate, if that helps. If you are, I know there are some people from Brazilian conservation groups here, which is fantastic. Tão bacana que vocês estão aqui também. So I'm very happy. Okay. We've got a question from Erica. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for sharing all these experiences and also your valued lessons. I always appreciate that very much, and really thank you for opening yourself to us. And I work for IFO. I'm in the coexistence, the human-wildlife conflict team. I work with jaguars that eat on dogs, prey on dogs, and dogs that like to prey on sea turtles. So it's always interesting to know about other species and the way that you approach communities. And I would like to know if there are any deterrents that you learned that the community was working on with the macaques, or any other place that you would like to share with us. Deterrents are always, a great tool, but I wonder if that's such a thing in that culture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Well, obviously the macaques do crop forage, and it's virtually impossible to stop them. And so when we get complaints about crop foraging, we go there, and because we're very, very heavily identified with the Barbary macaque, and there is nobody else, if the Barbary macaques do something, people will always come to us, and there's no point in trying to say, no, these are your monkeys, because they do take responsibility when good things happen, but when the stuff like the crop foraging happens, they're not so keen. So what we tend to do is say, look, we're really sorry, they've eaten your figs. They're probably going to do it again because there's nothing we can do to stop them, unless you want to grow your figs in a different place, which people don't generally want to do. But what tends to happen is then we offer them, we'll say, for example, would it be helpful if, as an apology from the macaques, we bring you a medical outreach team to the village? And that usually works very well, because health is hugely important to everybody, so we don't do any kind of economic kind of compensation or anything like that. That would be, a mess we didn't want to get into, but we will kind of say, okay, it's been really bad this year. Can we bring the medical outreach team to your village? And that usually works. And then recently, in the last couple of years, we had a massive wildfire in Buashim, which killed a lot of macaques and took away lots of people's possessions and villages. And our first reaction was, because the macaques had nothing to eat in some parts of the forest, but neither did the people. And so we tried to mobilize so that we could feed both at once. And that worked, obviously, you know, until the state aid kicked in. Once that kicked in, we were okay and we could concentrate on the macaques. But we also found that some macaques were traveling really long distances into people's fields. And when we asked people about it, they said it's fine, you know, they haven't got anything to eat either, and you fed us, so you know we can feed them for a while. But we did actually manage to stop them coming down because we supplemented their diet with acorns. And I know you're not supposed to do that, you're not supposed to provision privates, but we did it very, very, very carefully, and none of the macaques have been habituated. None of those groups have been habituated, because none of the groups are habituated in bushing, and none of the groups showing any signs of being habituated. And that stopped the long journeys down to the fields to crop forage. So yeah, I think sometimes it works, you know, without you even knowing it's going to work. Something you do works without you even knowing. You don't actually stop the behavior. I mean, the last time with the acorns we did, but sometimes you can people are satisfied that they've been listened to, that they've been heard, and that you have done something. You know, the fact that sometimes it's just, we just have to, all we have to do is listen to them complaining. And then we say, look, we're really, really sorry about them. There's nothing we could do to stop them. And they go, yeah, I know. And off they go. You know, they're fine about it. But sometimes you just have to listen and say, look, you know, we can't, there's nothing we can do. So I don't think that's very helpful for the jaguars eating the dogs, but that's, you know, everything is very context specific, as you know. And this works in our particular context.
Absolutely, but I think that, you know, these kind of conflicts just happen now in every species with humans that are all around. So thank you very much for sharing, really, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, for your question. It just makes us think. We're always going back to the active listening and the importance of, when we're talking about inclusion, that's very much what it means, isn't it? Securing a place where people can talk about, where you can listen, and people can talk about their concerns, their beliefs, their knowledge, and that the whole, during the whole process of the research of the translocation is something that we keep going back to in our guidelines, isn't it, Tran? I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very good example, you know, the Moroccan state does a lot of reintroductions, or usually of ungulates, and they built a very large enclosure in Bouachim ready for red deer, Barbary stags as they call them, and they didn't explain anything to the local communities, and the local communities kind of just vandalized the structures because they didn't know what it was, and we weren't sure what it was, so we couldn't, because they kept asking us, and we said we don't know, we didn't know either. I think a good example of how, you know, you can kind of, and you know, the other thing is, you're not just talking to communities, and you're not just dealing with communities, you're dealing with the state, you know, actors, state actors, people who represent the state and things like that, and you're dealing with other people like less perhaps more kind of people who view the environment as something to exploit. And we have a very good example now, it works very well, where I was telling you we sometimes saw groups of men on tractors and lorries with chainsaws illegally logging. And we started to report that to the regional forestry guard, but nothing would happen. And the shepherds, in the end, reported to the regional director, and it stopped immediately. So, you know, I'm not going to say why I think that was, but as things moved forward, the local shepherds and people would come to us and say, there's people logging in a certain place, can you go and tell the director? And that was the only way to get it stopped, because the shepherds would, you know, obviously they would be taking the blame for it, or they were threatened with getting blamed for it, and they didn't have the means to be able to do that. But they didn't like it either. They didn't like these people coming in and taking the trees. So we, you know, my Moroccan colleagues act as a kind of mediator between state actors and the communities, and it was the communities who kind of encouraged that, if you like. And I think that just shows how much trust my Moroccan colleagues have within the villages, etc. You know, in that area in that region of Morocco in general, really.
And would you say that that's because of the development of a long-term relationship? Or
Absolutely. I mean, you know, most of my colleagues are actually from the villages now. Many of them are ex-shepherds, and they are from the villages. And so, you know, things have changed dramatically in comparison to how things were in 2009. You know, there's crop foraging that goes on in some villages, and nobody even complains about it anymore. So, you know, that is how embedded my colleagues are in the area. And, you know, that's been going on, you know, since 2009 we've been working there. So it's a long commitment, but I think that's very valuable.
Do we have another question from anyone who is present, or a comment, or if you have an experience that you know, is a different case study, or if you found some difficulty you know, trying to do something like this, or if you come from a different place, would love to hear you. And we've got Kay. Do you want to unmute yourself, please, and introduce yourself and ask or talk?
Sure. I'm Kay Farmer. Hi, Sean. I work independently in the realm of wildlife welfare and conservation. And I'm just interested in sort of the longevity and sustainability, because I think that historically some people have, you know, kind of thrown animals out there and sort of thought that they could walk away quite quickly, when, you know, in reality, the possibility of the government structure taking over and doing X, Y, and Z is perhaps unrealistic. And so I wondered how you feel about that. You've obviously been there for a long time and you're embedded, but how do you think about succession and sustainability? Or do you kind of see yourself there, you know, for, I don't know, the next 10, 20, 30 years? How do you view that side of things?
Well, I have steadily kind of divorced myself from the day-to-day running of the project for some years now. We have, my colleagues are, you know, they do all that. I think our main problem is that it's hard to get money or funding, if you like, for just the ordinary day-to-day stuff. People always want you to do nice new projects and stuff, and we just want to carry on monitoring the macaques and engaging with the communities, and that takes a lot of time. I think longevity, I think, you know, we could probably walk away from Bouachim now, because there's nearly 5,000 macaques in there when we thought there were very few. But we could do that. But then, you know, I'm not sure that would be such a good idea from the point of view of the communities. I wouldn't want to feel like we'd let the communities down. And as I said, you know, some of the people, some of my colleagues are actually from the villages anyway. So yeah, I see it as a long-term undertaking that doesn't necessarily involve me. And we are moving forward now. We've got some funding to take on somebody younger, which doesn't, you know, who is willing to kind of look at it from a social science point of view as well, because it's very easy to find a lot of conservation scientists who only look at it from the quantitative point of view. And we really need somebody who's going to be able to, you know, to work from the ethnographic, from the social science point of view as well, or be open at least to being trained to do that, because that's, you know, that's what we based all our conservation strategy on, what we hear from people and how people behave towards the monkeys, etc. But yeah, from a longevity point of view, you know, I'm not going to live forever, and you know, as I say, I've kind of, I'm not the figurehead person in Morocco. It's Ahmed El Harad who is that, and that's always been the case. I'm kind of the international face of the project, just because the language obstacles, and Ahmed is the Moroccan person, and that's always been the case. So whenever there's any media or stuff like that in Morocco, then obviously I'm not going to do that. And the same token, when we have a confiscation or anything like that, then it's the Moroccan team who get involved in that. I've never been involved in anything like that because I think it's Moroccan business. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does wonderfully, thank you. And also you provided the great example there of, in a sense, how your role has evolved and transitioned into local hands. I suppose I'm assuming that most of your funding still comes internationally, does it, rather than coming from sources in Morocco, or are you getting actual funding from within Morocco?
No, I mean it's international. There's very little funding in Morocco available for conservation or anything like that, just because it's not a high priority. So yeah, I mean we get funding from a lot of some of the Mediterranean, the donors that fund for Mediterranean habitats and stuff, not specifically for the macaque, but for example, we do sustainable agriculture workshops and stuff like that, as people, villagers are saying, oh my goodness, the climate is changing, and we try and help them change with it, if you like, with various techniques that they can use instead. And they seem to be quite popular.
Okay, that's brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Kay.
Sean, how is the community, the conservation community, moving with times, do you think? Is there any kind of resistance in terms of supporting or funding or taking part in a project that's more inclusive of local communities? Or how do you feel that?
I think I don't think that is a problem. I think people are, even keener to fund that sort of thing now. It's hard to get funding to do qualitative investigations. Everyone wants to pay for, quantitative. They like numbers. Everyone likes numbers. Donors in particular like numbers because they deal in numbers all the time. I think it's hard, because I think that's, that was the basis of my conservation work in Morocco when I first started. We still take huge amounts of notice of what people are saying. So I think it's hard. Like I said, people always want you to be doing some new project. And for us, there's me who doesn't work in Morocco, and then there's my four colleagues who work in the field. And they have to do all the admin stuff and the permit stuff and all those things within Morocco itself, and they also have to monitor the macaques, and they also have to engage with the communities. And so there's really not a great deal of time left to do very much else. But yeah, I find that a problem, that donors tend to want you to do something different, So, I mean, we can sometimes, kill two birds with one stone by holding, the football tournament. So that's community work and conservation work, because it raises, well, they all know about the Barbary macaque, but we have posters and stuff about the macaques, and it kind of makes them more favorable towards the macaques because they get a football tournament. But it's not often you can get that kind of synergy, really. But yeah, that is tricky. I don't know if other people find that, there's always this constant desire for you to be doing something new.
If anyone else has an experience, I don't think Carlos is here today, but he would have things to say about golden lion tamarin in Rio as well, where it became a focus of so many projects, and this is how they're keeping it with I think the community, the local people took over, but in that way. Can we hear from anyone, from any participants, if you have any questions, or if you want to add some of your own experience? It would be great to hear.
Silence, came the stern reply.
It would be lovely to know about people's own experiences, isn't it?
Or does anyone violently disagree with me?
Yes,
we should just be doing it like we've always done.
Still silence.
I think everyone's gone for a cup of tea, Adriana. Oh, there's Paula. Hi, Paula.
I absolutely don't violently disagree with you, and I don't have any experience with translocation, but I'm like super excited to always hear you talk and kind of, you know, glean some information from you. But I do definitely relate to the things you had to say about working with local people. And where I was working in South Africa, I was the reserve I was on was surrounded by dairy farms, and the baboons were always eating the crops. They were in the milking parlors, and such conflict with the farmers. And I found, just like you found, that I really had to listen. I had to take a step back and I had to listen to their concerns. And we sort of brainstormed about how we could resolve some of their problems. And so, you know, I found out that I asked, is it possible for you to feed the cattle later? Because the baboons, you know, like clockwork, they go to the sleeping site at X time. And if you can feed them after the fact, and they were willing to try. And so we had this conversation, and I think over time and a whole lot of barbecues and a whole lot of beers, you know, just listening to them. And then I could tell them a little bit about how amazing the baboons were and interesting things that they were doing, because at that time I was doing more self-medication work, and they had no idea of all of the things animals do to maintain their health. And so I think over time we really, you know, grew to appreciate one another, and I became more compassionate about the problems that they face. And I think, you know, they would tell me that this individual was extremely aggressive. He lunged at my children. He did this, he did that, and I shot him. And I think as a primatologist, you know, it breaks your heart, but it's like you do have to care about the people. You do have to care about their livelihoods, or there's no possibility for coexistence. But
Sorry, Paula, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
oh,
Obviously, you know each other, but it would be nice to know more about your background.
My name is Paula Pebsworth. I'm also a primatologist, and I've shifted. I was studying self-medicated behavior under Mike Huffman at Kyoto University, and now I've kind of gone into the human coexistence realm with Sean. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to register a bunch of people to vote because we have an election coming up. But I'm sorry to have missed the very first part of your talk, but it was great to hear what you had to say, and please post sooner so I don't miss them.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, that was my fault. Yeah, thank you, Paula. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
It will be recorded, and we'll share the recording link, okay? But
Perfect.
thanks for your contribution. I just want
And
to add that, of course, our examples and our discussions, the group is focused on conservation translocation, but I think most of the conversations we have, they are wider than that. The subjects, they overlap with anything to do with wildlife conservation in general, just applied to one part of it, which is the translocation, yeah. But
I think what Paula brought up there, I think, you know, with the feeding the cattle later at night, you know, sometimes there's just that ping moment and you think, why aren't we doing this? Where will this work? And I saw a similar thing with elephant conflict in India, and people were making alcohol and they were keeping it kind of in a what they thought was a precious place in their house. And the elephants were knocking the house down to get to the alcohol. And so, you know, somebody suggested that they put it somewhere else. So at least then if the elephants did get to it, they wouldn't hurt anyone at the time. You know, at least that stopped any human injury. Obviously, the people didn't want to lose their alcohol. And who would, I mean, from my point of view. But, you know, these are the kind of moments you get. And you just think, oh, yeah, of course. Why don't we try that? And I think I think we should probably publish more stuff like that, you know, and you know, because that's the sort of stuff you only get when you're actually in the moment, in the field, and you're interacting with these people who are aggrieved and hate the animal that you're working with.
Right.
Or, you know, even if they don't hate it. But yeah, I think those are the moments. And I think we need to, you know, we need to kind of talk about that more. You know, it's not necessarily what you get by doing all these, collecting all these you know, these observations and everything else. It's a combination of huge amounts of things.
And I just will mention quickly that it was so nice, the conference at Oxford, where it had multiple disciplines. I really enjoyed that because I think we have a lot to learn from one another. Primatologists, I think in particular, we keep to ourselves or in our own little house. And I will just say, for the person who studies jaguars, to look at research and data that's been collected on leopards, because I know the Cape leopards in South Africa, they have huge conflicts. I don't know so much about dogs, but about livestock and the mitigation strategies that they've used with those king collars. And there's just different strategies that you can take, and to look at other disciplines and how they're addressing those issues. So, all right, I really have to go, but I'm going to say goodbye and thank you again.
Thank you. I know some people have to leave at 5, but if you can hang on, good luck with the elections.
Thank you.
If you can stay with us and continue the conversation, we have a comment from Monica. Monica will be talking next week. She'll be leading the talk, but Monica is saying that she's unpacking. So, but I agree with all that you presented, but positionally, but this is still something that most conservationists don't recognize. The biases we bring to the field and research. Yeah, so their problem is there are biases we bring to the field and research. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of my big things, you know, is the fact that we think we're coming in kind of clean and objective and all those things, and we're as subjective as everybody else, just because of our backgrounds.
I was remembering we had a discussion on another coexistence group last week about tapirs, and this researcher from the Amazon in Brazil was talking that his approach has been talking to subsistence farmers that if you have a robbery, you're not going to blame the police for your things disappearing, which would be the conservationists. Yeah? But the police might guide you on how to prevent the robbery to help happen in the future. So you will accept that you have to invest on some security locks and cameras and stuff. And in a way, when you are working with animals that might cause damage, is an interesting way of putting it, isn't it? And because he's part of the community and he knows where people are coming from, he is able to say this. But it's one of those examples you only hear about if you're in the field or if you are in a meeting like this. Yeah. But I don't know, I want to hear what you have, your opinion and other people's as well. This may be because we still don't have the space within the conservation publications or annual reports where this kind of narrative comes in, where you can share this kind of narrative. Is that what is missing?
I think in many, yeah. So for example, in primatology, we do have these outlets now that are journals who will accept a totally narrative, you know, like that's the stuff I've published. I think there's people in Nature, maybe they would, and Oryx, you know, they also, but I think, you know, it's very difficult as well for people because of the, you know, it's great to have these open access papers, but, you know, many of us can't afford, you know, if we're not working for an institution, we can't afford to publish. I mean, that's another thing about inclusivity. You know, that's a big problem. And I think, you know, access to literature as well. I mean, it's great that everything is more open access, but still some things are not. And that's, you know, that's all part of being inclusive. And, you know, what languages those papers are available in. Mm-hmm. That's another, you know, big problem. But I think, you know, these kind of what people would call anecdotal reports, I think that's, you know, a lot of the time, if you don't take notice of some of that anecdotal data, then your conservation project might not be as successful as it would be if you did. And I think that's where, you know, you've got very empathetic and you know, people who reflect on what people are saying to them. And like your colleague with the tapirs, he knew that community was of the community, and he knew what would you know, how he could communicate, what examples to use. And I think that it's all about, you know, long-term engagement, trust building, and this, you know, and all of that, underneath all of that is the active listening. And just saying, if you can't solve that problem, just say you can't do it. You know, like we did with the crop foraging, we can't do anything about it. They're cleverer than we are.
You're saying that your position as someone who comes from a developed country and has funding, creates expectations, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people expect us to be able to solve everything. And I mean, you know, we're not, you know, and people talk about interdisciplinarity. And, you know, it's hard to learn another discipline. You know, and so, you know, a lot of times I think, you know, there's conservation projects that kind of start off with all the best of intentions, and they're conservation scientists who are not necessarily trained to work with people, because they're not always. And then, you know, things go a bit wrong, and then somebody says, oh, let's bring a social scientist in, and we know that, you know, we're supposed to fix everything. And sometimes, you know, things have gone too far and you can't. But I think, you know, we're trying to do everything. You know, we've got a huge task in front of us a lot of the time, and I think sometimes you just have to focus on one thing or two things. And we focused on the macaques themselves and finding out where they were, and we focused on the communities. We didn't do anything else. We didn't do any education and awareness. We didn't do anything else, and that's what we did for 3 years.
Okay. Again, I'm going to invite people who are participating and listening. We would love to hear from you, and I would love to hear you share a question or an experience. Okay. I have other questions to ask, but then again, that's not the point. The point is to have people, you know, bring in your own ideas. It would be lovely to hear from you. We have some colleagues who participated in other talks. We have colleagues who have published with us, and it's lovely to have you here. Thanks for joining us. I hope to see you next week as well. Sean, I wanted to ask, while people are still thinking, if there is one piece of advice for a practitioner who wants to practice inclusivity, and you cannot say active listening again, what is it? Or is it actively?
Empathy. Be empathetic. You don't know how those people's lives have been. You don't know anything about them. You don't know what horrors could be lurking, you know, in some people's lives. And I think that's true of everyday living anyway. Be empathetic and, yeah, listen and reflect.
Do we always have to work together, conservation biologists and social scientists? Is it necessary to make the most out of finding solutions together with communities? Can you see other ways around it? I don't know. I come from conservation biologists, as you know, and I ended up working with people as you do, yeah. But I've learned a lot because of the people in our team, and that's the kind of advice we pass on. Yeah, work together with people who already know how to do it.
Yeah, and think, you know, like Paula said, look at what other people are doing, you know, and even if it's not the species and not your area, there may be, certainly for things like, you know, things like crop foraging and negative human-wildlife interactions, there may be mitigation techniques that are being used for other carnivores that you might not be able to use exactly the same thing, but you might be able to kind of develop it and maybe change it a bit so that you can use it in your area. I think it's great to get together and talk about stuff, but I think things, there's a lot of help we can give each other, but I think when it comes down to it, a lot of these areas and a lot of these places that we work are terribly context dependent. Everything depends on the context that you're working in. And so not everybody will know, will have, they might have, examples, but they may not necessarily relate to the context that you find yourself working in. So yeah, I mean, I think that goes for not just for conservation translocations, but, for everything else. And I think, we shouldn't, oh, we have a question. Let me shut up.
So Monica is unboxing and writing some things in between boxes. What to do when the community is not interested in participating in a proposed project? Accept and leave, or try to persuade? Could you share your thoughts on this, please?
I mean, I've never experienced it, but I think there are many occasions now in a lot of countries, certainly in Africa, where people are suffering conservation fatigue. And so they've had many different people and many different teams coming in, and not just in Africa, in other parts of the world. And they've not heard any more. They've given them information. They've filled in the questionnaires. They've done everything, and yet they see no benefits. They see nothing change. And that's something we need to be very, very careful of. I mean, that's why I didn't want to go into Morocco and stay and flit about all these sites and then come out again after 6 months, because I knew that wouldn't work. I think as well, we have to understand that, I know there's a lot of research projects going on throughout the world on wildlife, and research is not necessarily conservation. I think people get very confused about that. Research is research, and sometimes it can be applied, but most of the time it can't. Conservation is a different thing. And so I think you have to be very careful about how you manage all those things with people like the people that Monica is talking about, where they've just had enough. And then it's about building trust. You may think, right, okay, they're really against it. There's no point. Maybe I'll come back in a year. Maybe I'll come back in 2 years. Or, you just have to gauge the amount of resistance there is. Because don't forget, there won't always be this overt resistance where they just say, no, we don't want you, go away. If you come in, and they will overtly resist by doing other things that under the radar, which is how people, who feel they aren't powerful, have no power, that's how they kind of behave. I think that's the other thing as well, is we haven't even gone into the power relations kind of thing, but that's that's for another day. Monica, I don't know. I think it would very much depend on how. I mean, I think it's great that they're able to say that they don't want any conservation intervention. That's, at least they feel powerful enough to say that. So I think that's quite heartening. I would try and find out why, whether it's bad experiences in the past, and if it is, it depends on how bad those experiences were. But I'm sure you yourself have come across communities that they're just not interested, and some of it is due to conservation fatigue, and others is just distrust of outsiders because of past injustices.
I took a break from my box.
Hi, Monica. Would you like to comment? Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for your answer. I was thinking about the conservation fatigue, and from the indigenous perspective, so thinking about the area where I'm living and working, and what I hear sometimes is people just saying that they are tired of researchers coming to study them even though if it's for, you know, indigenous traditional knowledge or indigenous values, indigenous perspectives, or you name it, but they're just getting this fatigue of like, just stop coming and trying to understand how I live my life and how I see things. So there's also this element, and then it is connected with the trust and the building and the relationship and the history of who's in the field, who's there, who's not there, and the positionality as we talked about earlier. So I think it's really food for thought and things that we all should be considering and keeping in mind as we do our work or try to do our work and engage with communities. But this fatigue, I think it's becoming, at least from my own experience, just becoming more and more evident. People are just getting tired, and not only from outsiders coming, but just like engaging people in a way that you have to because of funding, or it's a demand of the project, it's a trade-off, but it just becomes so mechanic that it loses its meaning. Now I'm just thinking out loud here, but it's like around those themes.
Yeah. That's a great theme to discuss. It would be great if anyone has had this experience or would like to comment. I think to me, it seems like it relates to what Sean was saying about research and practice in conservation being two different things. And there's a lot of research that's done. And I guess the community doesn't see anything changing or going anywhere, but the same repeated consultation or engagement happening without that becoming something that will benefit them or something that they care about. Does it make a difference if they see that they are actually part of a change that they care about or not?
Nina has experience of this. She's in the chat.
Mina, where are you? Mina, would you like to come through? Hey,
there she is.
To see you. Please unmute yourself and quick introduction as well, please.
Yeah, so I'm Meena. I work mostly on lions. This experience comes from my work in South India, where the minute an outsider comes and the local tribal people will show anger and they will refuse to talk, and they said, "You just make money out of us. We are the means of your income, and we are still here." And like some kind of creatures here that you just ask some questions and then you become rich based on our status here. Nothing improves. So they feel that way, and they feel so much anger, and after a while they refuse to engage with you. So what I have done subsequently is, always when I have approached people, I tell them that my intention is to just understand and report your problems. I'm only via media between the manager and the people. I can communicate, express your problems in reports. For instance, in the lion area, what happens is the subsidized electricity is at night times. So the farmers go in the night to irrigate their farms. At that times, they encounter leopards, and there are some conflict and all that. So these kind of things you can find out and highlight in a report, so maybe we can have policies that would give these subsidies during day, a safer time, and what safeguards you can give when the farmer is guarding his crops and things like that. You need not always provide a better livelihood or provide money or build something, or so these sociological studies do give these kind of information that can be reported, rather than solving a livelihood problem or some uplifting people from poverty, improving lives. But just that at the start, we have to set the expectation very straightforward.
I think that's huge, you know, managing expectations, and we've talked about that as a group before, you know, and I think that's what I was trying to say, you know, when we talk about crop foraging of the Barbary macaques in Morocco, we say, look, there's nothing we can do. We can't stop them, and we're sorry. And now, you know, not everyone's in a position where they want to say that, but I think that's, you know, you have to be honest. And I think, you know, what Monica's saying, you know, we get this term parachute science, where people go in, they do their 3-month research project and they leave. And I think there's quite a lot of literature on that now, you know, in the journals and stuff, where people are saying, you know, this isn't a great thing to be doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like you've brought up again that sometimes these solutions that to reduce these negative interactions are quite simple. And it's just a question of trying to persuade people to change their behavior. And in your case, for the electricity provision, of course. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying about, in a way, well, if you can be that voice, isn't it? A voice that they need, an intermediate voice, and that's a clear expectation. But it's limited to that, but it can become something else. I guess the clarity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else would like to comment? Oh, gosh, it's almost time to finish. I think we can fit in another question, perhaps before we talk about our next. And I've got another question, but I would prefer someone else ask something, because mine is a bit polemic, but it's about the theme for these discussions. Okay, we wanted to talk about the need to decolonize conservation and conservation translocation as part of it, and it is a very loaded word. It's got very deep roots and very uncomfortable meanings. But I wanted to ask everyone who is here if we need to talk about decolonizing conservation, and is it a dirty word that we should not be using? I don't know if Sean wants to define. Do we need that? No, you don't need. But I'd like to hear from people. What do you think about it? If you have any experiences or comments. We've got people from different parts of the world and different experiences with what we're calling mainstream form of doing science and a historic way of doing conservation and ways of challenging it and being more inclusive and listening. But I'll leave the question in the air. We can, think about it, bring this to the conversation. I'm going to ask Sean to close with some key messages or key ideas from our discussion and from your talk. And then I'd like to share our invitation for next week again. Sean.
I hate doing this summing up thing. Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for sticking with it. I hope you found it useful. I'm not sure if what I said made sense. I hope it did. And I hope that you maybe kind of, got a bit of a light bulb moment, maybe at some point, through the presentation, where you could relate to something that I've been through or what I've experienced. And I think it is all about, person experience and actually, like with me, as I said, I'm a bit slow on the uptake, and I had to be hit on the head with a big hammer by the Blackfeet tribe in a very gracious and polite manner. But they got the message through. And I'm deeply grateful to them for that and for their tolerance. But yeah, I think it's about, you know, being aware of our own backgrounds and how that influences our work and our day-to-day living and everything else. And I think that matters even if you're working within your own country. Because, you know, I could go to Scotland and things would be very different than they are in the South Wales valleys, for example. Or I could be working with Welsh farmers who are, you know, very different to people who live in towns, to Welsh towns. So, you know, be aware that, you know, not everyone's life experiences is the same as yours, and not everyone's had the same opportunities as you have, or not, as the case may be. And, you know, listen and reflect. And that's it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sean. I think it was a very exciting and inspiring talk and discussion. And I thank everyone for taking part. I'm just going to try and share my screen once more to invite you to our discussion next week. Monica, as you heard Monica talking a little bit, so next Tuesday at the same time, she'll be talking about Indigenous co-management-led research, and we invite everyone to take part. I think I'll try and share this link to enroll. You need to enroll again to take part. And if you'd like to be part of our working group, please just share your details with me or get in touch and we can arrange that and you receive all of our invitations and resources, okay? Thank you very much. Thanks again, Sean. And we'll be able to share the recording and you can invite your friends to the next, colleagues to the next one. Thank you all.
Shall I stop the recording?
Yeah. Why'd you do that? Just press the record.